Hello and welcome to this episode of Futures, the podcast series brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Hi everyone and welcome to the CIPS Futures podcast. James Moore here alongside my co-host for today, Matthew Rock. And we're delighted to bring you one of the sharpest minds on global supply chains going. It really is an opportune time to speak to him as the situation in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz remains volatile, despite a fragile ceasefire currently ongoing. And I think it's worth setting some context for this conversation. We're recording this on Tuesday, the 21st of April. What we do know is there has been and will continue to be a significant impact on our profession. The latest CIPS Pulse research showed that procurement is operating in a world of heightened risk and anxiety, but everything moves very quickly. So what we're going to do is take us out of the immediate context and just try and step back a little. And also, as part of the great conversation that CIPS is having this year, we want to get a broader view on the implications of what all of this geopolitical fragmentation means for how professionals need to think about the future of supply chains. Or perhaps we should say supply webs, as we'll get to in a bit. So a warm welcome to today's guest, David Shillingford. David, I'll let you introduce yourself. I know you wear a few hats, so do you want to just give us a bit of your background and your expertise in the world of supply chains?
Thank you very much, James. Thanks for the invitation to join you. By way of a very brief background, career number one in the British Army, career number two as a technology company founder, career number three, CEO of a venture capital based company. Then I moved over to the venture capital side, and now I am in an advisory role with a number of high growth technology startups that focus on solving supply chain problems.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. I'm going to start with quite a big question, quite a broad question. And I'm going to jump straight in. Do you think we are beginning to see a remapping of global supply chains and maybe a shift in the status quo of trade flows?
So I'll take the second bit first. There's certainly a shift in the status quo of trade flows. No doubt about that. Trade, like water, will find the path of least resistance. And that's exactly what is happening now and frankly has been happening for a while. And I think in terms of remapping global supply chains, that's something that has arguably been happening for some time. I think if you go back to the first Trump presidency, a lot of companies were trying to figure out how to reduce their reliance upon China based upon the first round of tariffs. And that is something that has continued to today. Of course, in 2026, the types of disruptions that we're seeing are causing companies to ask even more questions about what their supply chain should look like. The remapping has started, but it's in its very earliest stages.
David, you're very modest in your description of your career and things. I want to put it on the record that your LinkedIn and your posts on LinkedIn are excellent, and I recommend it to all of our listeners to follow them and to read up on those.
Thank you, Matthew. It's very kind of you.
Picking up on what you were just saying, there's this notion that Ben Farrell, the chief executive of CIPS, is playing with and airing the notion of the supply web rather than the supply chain. And I'd love to get your thoughts on whether you accept that as a way of thinking and whether you think it's useful. It strikes me that, clearly supply webs are much more complex and probably reflect the complexity that we see in the global supply system. Part of the analogy, of course, is that supply chains can break, whereas supply webs can, dislocate but then heal themselves. So I wonder I'd just love to get your thoughts on whether you think that supply webs rather than supply chains is a useful way of thinking today.
Yeah, I strongly agree with it. I think the metaphor of a chain is really a misrepresentation of the reality. The fact that we've called it supply chain for as long as we have is I guess, as a historical artifact. They are clearly networks, and I like the idea of a web. It's a good metaphor. I mean, we use a lot of metaphors from nature in supply chain, normally on the disruption side. So it's good to have one that is a good metaphor for not just the complex structure, but the way in which that web is resilient. So I like it. I think it's a great way to think about what we have traditionally called supply chains.
And it's perhaps a more compelling way of speaking upwards to the C-suite as well. If you're able to talk about, the complexity of the ecosystem that you are managing, rather than trying to talk to them about single supplier relationships.
Yeah, I agree. I think ecosystem is another helpful word, because ecosystems, again, in nature, are by definition symbiotic and self-supporting and multi-directional. And that's the way that people have to think about supply chains in the future, because no company, frankly, no country is an island. There is the interdependencies. When you think about the pressures that have been applied to global supply chains over the last few years, the interdependencies that have been put under incredible pressure persist. And that's really a mark of the importance of where raw materials come from, where other inputs come from, and that no single company or country can do it all themselves.
Moving from that point, I'd love to get your views about choke points. The world knew about the Strait of Hormuz historically, potentially a vulnerable point. That's now come to reality, and we're all dealing with the consequences. But it's become evident that there are a handful of critical choke points in global trade. Suez, we also knew about the Strait of Malacca, and there are a handful of others as well. I'd love to get your thoughts on, do you think this now is in the consciousness of business leaders, of supply chain professionals, that these choke points, they need to be studying them and they need to be thinking about their vulnerabilities to them?
Short answer is yes. I think the things that have changed as you think about disruptions to choke points over the last few years, maybe going back to the Panama Canal, that was more of an environmental disruption because of drought, and the way in which the Houthis were able to disrupt traffic through Suez. I think what's different about the Strait of Hormuz is not only has Iran been able to effectively shut it down, but it demonstrates to other countries, other adversaries, and the world in general, that not only can this be done, but of the leverage that it provides to those who are doing it. And when we think about choke points, a big part of that is optionality. What if this is blocked? What are my options? And we're talking about maritime choke points because they exist because of geography that you can't change. And if you're sailing ships that are full of crude oil with millions of gallons, it's very difficult to create anything other than a maritime option. And your maritime options are extremely limited. So the world is certainly learning a lot of lessons as a result of what is happening. But I think it's part of a broader topic that I think of as risk concentration. So it's not just maritime choke points. There are other types of choke points. You can think about if there's a bridge collapse, it happens suddenly, and people are suddenly aware that they were pretty reliant upon that bridge, and you can get around it, but it takes a long time. There are other types of risk concentration, such as materials. We saw this with critical minerals. The negotiations between the Chinese and the US changed dramatically when the Chinese started to pull the lever they have as the producers of 90% of the world's critical minerals. And there are plenty of other examples of where risk concentration exists in supply chains. And although we don't maybe know what's going to happen with environmental risk or geopolitical risk, what we do know is where those risks are greatest because of risk concentration.
Highly recommend, if anybody's not read Tim Marshall's The Power of Geography. I think it's a really straightforward, very well explained book around the geopolitical situation and how where these choke points might exist. I think it's a really useful way of looking at it. So I'd recommend that. But on those critical sort of materials, those choke materials, as I called it earlier, what is there anything else that should be on our radar as procurement and supply chain professionals that we all depend on, but we don't actually realize? You look at what's happened in the Strait of Hormuz, and oil and LNG was came up immediately, but then the knock-on effects to fertilizer and other types of materials happened. Is there anything that you think we should be aware of? You mentioned China already, but what's your perception of that?
It's a very long list of examples of what we might describe as global or industry level risk concentration. I think the semiconductor industry is a very good example of this because it is, because of its technical complexity, there are a limited number of companies that are able to perform the various different phases of converting silicon into semiconductor chips. You've got examples with ASML, who makes the equipment that is fundamental to building the factories that make the chips. That they are, in some respects, the only company that makes certain types of that equipment. TSMC is well known as having an enormous market share when it comes to, particularly for advanced microprocessors. And you can go up and down the semiconductor chip supply chain and find different types of risk concentration up and down it. And this matters because so many other industries depend upon semiconductors. The auto industry is a good example where if you can't get the right chip for the right car, you can't make the car. Even there are thousands of other parts that need to go into it. And some parts are easier to substitute than others. Chips, not so much. And sometimes auto manufacturers are competing for chips with other industries that might be higher on the ladder when it comes to the margins that they can support.
I think this comes back towards scenario planning a lot of the time. This isn't necessarily a new concept, I suppose, but it feels like it's becoming more part of procurement and supply chain professionals' remit now. Do you think that procurement people are now best placed to envisage the most critical scenarios that an organization might face?
So I would say that procurement professionals are well placed. I'm not sure I'd say they're best placed, because I think it's risky to single out a single function as those with the answer. I think the organizations that I see making the most progress towards understanding what their supply web looks like and understanding the risks and how likely those risks are, and more importantly, the impact of those risks, are those that are able to take a cross-functional approach to this. Procurement has an enormous amount of the data and expertise that's needed to understand this, but without understanding your logistics network and logistics risk, then you're sitting on a one-legged stool. I would argue, actually, that the compliance function is one that is a critical leg of this stool, not just because they are doing things that the company has to do, but because of the type of data that they are collecting in increasing levels of detail and increasingly beyond tier one suppliers, because they have to, whether it's to do with hazardous material compliance, whether it's to do with compliance with international labor laws or other types of trade compliance. The compliance department is, because they have to, collecting very detailed data about a supply chain network. And most companies are not leveraging that data for the types of scenario planning use cases that we're talking about.
David, just picking up on that, which organizations or indeed industries, where are you seeing really good examples of kind of cross-functional high visibility in terms of risk?
I often point to the auto industry for a couple of different reasons. The first is they have one of the most complex supply webs out there. Number two, partly as a result of that, they have been on the front end of disruptions going decades back. Thinking of the tsunami in Japan in 2011, the auto industry learned a lot of very painful lessons about risk concentration that was a number of tiers up their supply chain away from their own manufacturing plants. And as a result, they have for many years been working on building out this idea of multi-tier visibility to their supply webs. And they, as a result, are as sophisticated as any in understanding this, and therefore have done a good job of bringing together not just their suppliers and their upstream version of that, but thinking about their logistics networks and how can they, in both directions, leverage the expertise and data in their compliance departments.
Can we talk about, for a moment, conflict zones? We were on a webinar together a couple of weeks ago, and a question popped into the chat during the webinar, which I thought was so powerful and interesting. We think about conflict zones and we feel as if we understand where the hotspots are. Unfortunately, the hotspots are often in the Middle East. We know about Ukraine. We probably have a strong sense of the South China Sea as being a potential conflict zone. But the comment that came into the webinar was that cheap technology, and specifically drones, makes any part of the world, any location, any industry, a potential immediate conflict zone. And it's quite a dark thought, clearly, and we would hope and pray that it doesn't affect the people on this listening to this podcast. But it is something that is going to have to be on the minds of any professional thinking about continuity and risk concentrations, etc. I'd love to get your thoughts about it.
Yeah, it is a fascinating topic. I think there's a few different lenses to look at it through. One is the futuristic lens of drones and autonomy, and I'm not going to go there because that's potentially dark and is definitely unknown. Another lens is to go back in time and to acknowledge that since the dawn of humankind, there has been this asymmetry between a force with superior weaponry and another opposing force that had to figure out a way of addressing that the fact that the enemy had superior weaponry. I think what we're seeing with drones that is interesting is more so that it creates an economic asymmetry in the opposite direction with superpowers. I think there's really been, if I have to use a multi-million-dollar missile to shoot down a $30,000 drone, then the numbers are very much against me. So I think that's one big change. We've obviously seen, out of necessity, a lot of innovation in Ukraine. So in terms of how does this change the face of geopolitics and therefore supply chain risk, I think that's yet to be seen. But I think that if large powers act belligerently, they may live to regret that, thanks to this economic asymmetry of modern warfare. We're seeing that play out we have been seeing that play out in Ukraine. We are seeing that play out in the Gulf. I think it means that the idea of a quick resolution to asymmetric warfare is less likely. Therefore, things are more likely to drag on. It means that economic warfare becomes a more important tool because things are dragging on. Again, we're seeing that in the Gulf right now. So I think that the best advice for supply chain professionals, it really comes back to scenario planning, because to the extent that the old rules don't apply anymore, it creates more uncertainty. And the wrong lesson to learn from uncertainty is, well, if I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, I don't want to overreact and therefore I'm going to do nothing. The answer is scenario planning, because I can model an infinite number of outcomes and I can test my hypothesis. I can look at different outcomes, different impacts. I can model the probability of each happening. So what is excusable is to say, well, I didn't know that was going to happen yesterday. What is not excusable is to say, I haven't got a plan for that. I haven't thought about that.
Are there any trends in how organizations are responding in terms of recalibrating their supply chains? I know you said we're quite early on in the remapping process, but anything, whether that be nearshoring or localization or friendshoring, or any comments on that?
Yeah, there are quite a few things that companies can do and have been doing. And from a network design standpoint, the thing that's most talked about is nearshoring or friendshoring. And I mean, I think what is interesting about that is that there are multiple factors and forces that might cause a company to reshore their business. Tariffs alone is generally not enough. Most of the calculus, when you think about the cost of tariffs versus the cost of reshoring, a lot of companies are prepared to pay the tariffs, particularly if they think that they are temporary. It's unlikely that a company is going to make a large capital investment as a result of something that may or may not be permanent. But the idea of shortening supply chains in terms of cost, in terms of resilience, in terms of emissions, in terms of speed to market, there's a lot of reasons for companies to think about how they might shorten their supply chains. And that argues more for a regional approach to having as much as you can get into your supply chain as close to the market that you're serving as possible. And you've seen large AstraZeneca, I think, is a good example of a large global client that for some years now has been thinking about the Chinese market and Western markets essentially as two different supply chains, both in terms of how they go about it, where things come from, and we'll certainly see more of that. But it'll be a slower change, and because of multiple factors, particularly speed to market. But there's also a lot of things that companies can and have been doing on a more tactical basis, where shipments are being rerouted, or maybe more in the middle ground where you're thinking about, well, my sole supplier is in a country that I feel a lot less comfortable about now. I still need them, but I need a plan B. And maybe I find a supplier, but I don't engage. Maybe I engage and I give them a smaller part and I can scale that up. So having optionality is generally a less expensive way than fully committing to moving in entire networks. So companies are doing this, but they're doing it gradually.
David, I think I'm right in saying you work with and advise investors in supply chain innovation. So speaking of what's going on in the world of the supply chain sort of industry itself, what are the most interesting innovations and investment opportunities that you're seeing in the supply chain sphere?
Yeah, it's a great and interesting question. And I think any discussion like this today, right now, is going to start with AI. But I'm most interested in what's to the left or the right or above or below AI, because AI itself is, I think, arguably commoditized. Every company has access to pretty much the same AI models. The question is, what do you do with it? And although the factors here aren't really new, I think they are more important than ever to think about what is the type of company that becomes more valuable and more defensible as a result of what we are seeing with the rapid advances is in AI. So I think, one example would be a company that's got, a large and unique and valuable data set. That's a company that would become more valuable as a result of the things that you can do with that, the way that you can scale that as a result of AI. I think a second one, which is a bit of a variation on that theme, is what I think of as new data. Maybe ground truth data is a better way of thinking about that. So things like the data coming out of IoT sensors, the data coming out of computer vision systems, because it's ground truth data and it's granular and it is real time and it has high frequency, high fidelity. You can build things on top of that with AI, particularly agentic AI, that allows for higher levels of automation than you would get with traditional supply chain data. So I think that's a second area that's interesting. Third is really just to talk about services. I think that service companies become more interesting, more valuable with AI, because not only can you do more with less, but the type of workflows and relationships and expertise that you have in supply chain services companies become much more valuable as a result of their ability to leverage AI tools. And I think in all of these cases and beyond, integration, getting the right data in the right place at the right time is a critical element. And I think more and more we will see that companies where that is their primary mission rather than something that is enabling other things. So I think we'll see more integration platforms because they will become more important and more valuable. And if you take all of these and put them together, that's the type of company that I'm looking for and talking to and supporting.
And just to follow up to that, why should procurement professionals or procurement and supply chain leaders care about these kinds of these data sets and this technology that is it essentially changing how supply chains operate?
Yeah, I think if you look at this through the lens of procurement, there are data sets that have traditionally not been available to procurement professionals that tend to be outside of their own four walls, thinking about what would I love to know about a supplier that I'm thinking of engaging, or what would I love to know about a supplier that I have already engaged. And rather than surveying every supplier, I would love to know what question I should ask which supplier at what time. And the kind of outside in view of an entire network and layering external data on top of that provides enormous opportunities for operational improvement, risk management, and some of the things that the industry has struggled with for years and are becoming more and more important as the world becomes more uncertain and more volatile.
Yes, I guess that shift in prioritization to security of supply that we're seeing, and resilience really playing a key part of that. David, we always like to try and finish on a practical question. What would your practical advice be of how best to navigate this sort of macro geopolitical supply chain risk that we're experiencing at the moment?
So, yeah, I've got a few. So, well, first of all, is number one is map your supply chain. And when I say map, people use that word a lot, but it's important to be clear about that. That means finding out what your products are made of, where those inputs come from, and where the inputs to those inputs come from. It is a journey. There's no magic button for that. Every company should be on that journey to map and analyze as much of their supply chain, their supply web, as they possibly can. Number two is think about it cross-functionally. A lot of that data already exists within your organization. It may be with the logistics department. It may be within compliance. Go and ask for it. Figure out what you need, work out what that looks like, and then ask your colleagues for it. There's a lot of it that's outside your organization. The good news is that companies have been organizing that data for a while now, so help is around the corner. Number three is scenario modeling. There's no excuse, and there are more and less sophisticated ways of doing this, but there's no excuse for not modeling out different scenarios as to what might happen. To say, well, that's unlikely, so I'm not going to worry about it, doesn't make any sense. Model all of the scenarios and their impacts. And finally, I would say, put a number on it. I think that the biggest challenge that companies have when they think about resilience is that it remains a concept rather than something that is actionable, because people are not putting numbers against it. It's very, very difficult to do. But again, it's a journey. It's something that just because it's hard to do doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying. Try and understand the cost of risk as much as you can. And if it's directional or if it's a range, that's okay. You've got to start that journey to say, what is my cost of risk? Because if you don't have that, it's very difficult to have the decision about, well, an extra supplier costs me X. Does that decrease my risk by more or less than X?
So that's it for this episode of Futures. Thanks very much for listening, and a huge thanks to David for joining us and sharing his really useful and helpful perspective on the volatility that we're currently experiencing in global supply chains. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed this episode. That's it from us. This podcast has been brought to you by CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. For more information on CIPS, head over to cips.org, where you can find out more about our upcoming events and all the excellent training opportunities on offer. See you next time.